Get ready, because today we're going to talk about main plots, subplots, and how to juggle them over the course of a story. A number of my subscribers requested this topic, and what we're going to do, we're going to start by talking about why a story needs multiple plot lines, then we'll look at how to weave them together, and finally I'll give you 5 game-changing tips for using multiple plot lines. First, let's talk about why we need multiple plot lines. I came up with 4 reasons. The first is variety. This is pretty obvious. If we only have one plot line, we're going to get burned out before long. So in order to keep things fresh, we want to bounce from one plot to another. The second reason is pacing, which is the speed at which a story is told. If the pace is static, it sucks and we get bored. That's why we want to spend 5 minutes in one plot, then 2 minutes in another, 3 in the next, and so on. It's also why certain plot lines should vary in terms of intensity. If everything is intense, nothing is intense. So we need to alternate between high, medium, and low stakes events. The third reason is complexity. When we include multiple plot lines, they all add specific ingredients to the meal. Maybe they show us different sides of the same conflict, or they explore different aspects of a particular character, or they enhance our understanding of a larger world. When done right, they should create a layered story that is more than just the sum of its plot lines. Finally, the fourth reason is unpredictability. When a story juggles multiple plot lines, the audience has to focus on more than one thing. This enables certain events to land with surprising impact, which can energize the story while keeping the audience guessing about future events. Now let's talk about how to weave your plot lines together. First off, you want to identify your central plot. Most stories will have just one central plot where a protagonist and antagonist battle each other until the outcome is decided. Larger stories like Game of Thrones may have multiple central plots, but usually you're going to have one. To locate it, figure out who your protagonist is, what their main story goal is, and then you should be able to easily identify the central conflict. Step 2 is to identify your subplots. These are supporting plots, and the easiest way to spot one is by looking at character relationships. If there's a romance, mentorship, friendship, or a family bond, chances are there's a subplot. These tend to be less intense than our main plot, but they allow us to explore characters, layer the story, and build toward critical moments in the main plot. And that brings us to step 3, which is the weaving itself. This is all about balancing out the spotlight. Once you introduce your plots, then it becomes a game where you shift the focus back and forth between them. Weaving is all about moving the story forward while recognizing when to jump between different plot lines. The central plot can't do all the work, so the spotlight must occasionally shift towards subplots. Now keep in mind, when you focus on a subplot, that doesn't mean you have to pause or abandon the central plot. Oftentimes we might have 2 characters engaging with the central conflict, and while they're doing this, we shift the focus to their relationship subplot. Then, after exploring that, we return our focus back to the main plot. The important thing to keep in mind here is that the central plot is what focuses and grounds the story. Subplots may overlap with it, or they might temporarily carry the story, but eventually we have to return to that central plot because that's what gives the story its identity. Now let's look at 5 game-changing tips for using multiple plot lines. The first one is to prepare your audience for significant plot jumps. Typically, when we shift from one plot line to another, we don't want it to be an abrupt or disorienting experience. Rather, we want to signal where the story is going, and we want the audience to understand why this other plot line matters. In the first episode of Game of Thrones, there's a lot of jumping around as the show introduces Winterfell, as well as a massive cast of characters. Then we also get 2 large-scale jumps that send us to Daenerys Targaryen's plotline, which is disconnected from the rest of the story. Now, the show could have just cold jumped into Dany's plotline, but that would run the risk of feeling jarring or random. Instead, the show prepares us for the jump by having characters discuss the Targaryen family. The first time this happens is about 33 minutes into the episode, when Ned and Robert have this discussion.
It's done, Your Grace. Targaryens are gone.
Not all of them.
Then boom, the story shifts and introduces Dany and her brother. By preparing us for this jump, the writers signal that Dany's plotline is relevant to the Winterfell one, even though the characters on both sides won't encounter each other anytime soon. Later, about 50 minutes into the episode, the show jumps to Dany's storyline once again. It's set up nicely with a discussion about the previous king, who was a Targaryen.
A different time. A
different king.
From there, we shift to Dani's wedding and continue with her storyline. Now, keep in mind, you don't need to do this with every single plot jump. That would get annoying fast. But if you're making a large-scale jump or returning to a plot line that you haven't visited in some time, you may want to prepare your audience. Tip number 2 is to manage pacing with questions and answers. We talked about pacing earlier in the video, and a great way to boost your pace is by raising questions whenever you shift away from a plot line. So let's say we have 2 plot lines, a main plot and a subplot. We'll say that we're in the main plot and we don't want it to get stale, so we're going to switch to our subplot. Now, if we resolve the current conflict in the main plot and tie everything up neatly before switching over, the audience has nothing to look forward to. Instead, what we want to do is keep the audience in suspense over what will happen in that main plot. And we do this by raising a question before jumping to the other plot line. The question can be big or small, high stakes or low stakes, but we want to give the audience something to anticipate. We want to raise a question and withhold the answer until later. This not only energizes the story, but it also buys us some time to explore low-energy scenes. The movie The Fugitive does a great job with this. For the most part, the story alternates between 2 major plot lines. One follows a fugitive named Richard Kimball who's trying to prove his innocence by finding his wife's killer. Then there's another plot line where a U.S. Marshal named Sam Gerard is trying to capture Kimball. Whenever the story shifts between these 2 plot lines, it raises a relevant question. Now, the movie opens with Kimball receiving a death sentence before a magical train crash allows him to run free. That raises the question, will Kimball safely escape the area? Before we get an answer, the movie shifts to the other plot line and introduces Gerard. The energy is lower here, but because Kimball's plotline boosted the pacing with a question, we have an easier time engaging with this intro. We see how driven and meticulous Gerard is, and before cutting back to Kimball's storyline, the movie raises the question, how soon will Gerard's team locate their fugitive? This question raises the stakes as Kimball sneaks into a hospital and cleans himself up. He then steals an ambulance, and the question becomes, will he reach his new destination? That's when we shift to Gerard again. He traps Kimball inside a tunnel, and both characters meet for the first time. It leads to an iconic moment when Kimball jumps to his apparent death in order to avoid capture. This scene then ends with the question, did Kimball survive? And if so, will Gerard continue searching for him? The rest of the story continues to raise similar questions, and it allows the movie to maintain a steady, satisfying pace while keeping the audience in suspense. Tip number 3 is to use theme to unify different plot lines. Theme is the glue that holds a story together, and it's a great tool for determining whether different plot lines belong in a particular narrative. If we think of theme as a unifying idea, that allows us to draw connections between plot lines. Even if certain plot lines don't directly impact each other, they can still explore a common theme that creates a sense of overlap. For example, in the first episode of Game of Thrones, the theme is taking on new burdens. We see this in the prologue when a man encounters the White Walkers and runs south of the Wall to warn others. We see the theme again when Ned Stark is tasked with becoming Hand of the King, and again when Daenerys is forced to marry in order to restore House Targaryen, and then yet again when Jon Snow considers joining the Night's Watch. Using theme to connect everything is especially important here because Dany's storyline is disconnected from the others on the surface level. She doesn't meet anyone from Winterfell, but her plotline nonetheless belongs here because it shares the same theme as the others. Tip number 4, remember that one character can drive multiple plot lines. New writers often make the mistake of thinking that if the story is from the perspective of one single character, that means the story only has one plot line. But that's not the case. One POV character can be involved in several subplots, each of which should explore a different side of that character. Last week I did a video on the pilot episode of The Penguin, and the episode is almost entirely from Oz's perspective. Now, if the story relied purely on the central plot of Oz trying to take over the criminal underworld, we would lose interest pretty quickly. Thankfully, however, the episode stays fresh by exploring subplots while pushing the central plot forward. Early on, we get a mentor subplot involving a young criminal named Victor. Oz initially wants to kill the kid, but he ultimately teams up with Victor, and they develop a twisted father-son type of bond. From there, it's back to business as Oz returns to his drug operation and tries to gain power. Then he gets called in by the higher-ups in the Falcone crime family. Halfway through the episode, we get introduced to Sophia Falcone, who is both a potential threat and a potential ally. Soon after, we get another subplot involving Oz's mother. They have a strange relationship, and she encourages him to seize power by any means necessary. That's what motivates Oz to keep his drug operation from getting shut down. In order to strike back at the Falcones, he visits an imprisoned crime boss named Salvatore Maroni. This kicks off a partnership subplot between Oz and Maroni, and the episode ends with multiple plot lines converging in thrilling fashion. And that brings us to tip number 5, which is to have plot lines collide at key moments. Now, if you want fireworks in a story, create opportunities where your central plot and subplots can overlap in dramatic fashion. If done right, your story will erupt with shock value, complexity, and emotional impact. Going back to The Penguin, the show's first episode concludes with the central plot and multiple subplots hitting all at once. If you remember, Oz's quest for power leads him to get captured by Sophia, who threatens to kill him if he doesn't reveal the location of her brother. That's when Victor, from the mentorship subplot, sends an empty car to the Falcone residence with her brother's body in the trunk. The murder is made to look like it was done by the Maronis, which lights up another subplot, and in the end, Oz is allowed to go free and continue his quest for power. It's also worth noting that Oz's actions were motivated by his mother in their subplot. So basically, the entire episode builds toward this ending and feels smart and cohesive as a result. I'll give you one more example before we wrap things up, and this is a simple one. It's the end of the first episode of Game of Thrones, which has the central plot of the Starks and Lannisters battling for control. Then there's a family subplot where Bran Stark is warned not to climb buildings, and a romantic subplot involving Jaime and Cersei, who are brother and sister. When Bran catches them having a not safe for work moment together, Jaime attempts to kill the boy. This final moment raises the stakes and intensifies the struggle between the Starks and Lannisters, and it's all made possible by having the main plot and two subplots collide. So I hope this helps. Question of the day: what is your favorite plot line from your favorite story? Let us know in the comments section below. Thank you for watching. If you want to support the channel, please pick up a copy of any one of my books and be sure to leave reviews on Amazon. The Half Murders is great if you like horror stories. It's about a woman and her daughter who enter a haunted house. They get chopped in half, and for them, the nightmare is only beginning. Also, be sure to check out my other videos, like, share, and subscribe. Maybe support me on Patreon. And as always, remember to keep on writing.